Okay, I think it's 10:30 now. We welcome everyone. I think Michael Venter is our technical person. So Michael, I hope everyone you can just, and we've got Julie Claessens as our first speaker. So welcome. The three speakers of today, they're all friends of the Winter School and they've participated in several Winter Schools. So thanks again for your participation. We really appreciate that. And just introduce you and just something about the program. We've got half an hour for each speaker. At the end, we will have a discussion of 30 minutes. So you're welcome. If you on the show conversation field wants to ask a specific question to a specific speaker, you're welcome also to formulate a question there, but also orally you're welcome afterwards. So I will give 30 minutes, and Julie, just after 25 minutes, I will just say 5 minutes. I think most of you will know Julie. She's a professor at the Department of Old and New Testament and also the head of the gender unit at the faculty. She wrote several books, several articles, and also all over the world. She's a speaker at different conferences. So we're really privileged to have you today at the Winter School. So it's always nice that you make time for the Winter School and also share everything you've learned all over the world. So thanks again, Julie, and also blessings for your work at the university as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dani, and also for the invitation to participate again in the Winter School. Yes, making time or space for you this morning. Up till now, we were busy with this 5th years with preaching, sort of giving feedback there. So yeah, so my colleagues, we are multitasking. So I'm missing out this morning, but so glad that I could be now here with you. So I'm speaking to you this morning, also sort of part of my recently published a monograph. I will say a bit about that. But sort of but the topic is reading biblical and contemporary trauma narratives, so bringing things into conversation. And I want to start with a quote from Toni Morrison that regarding jazz, sort of saying, "Jazz always keeps you on the edge. There is no final chord. There may be a long chord, but no final chord. And it agitates you. There's always something else that you want from the music." In an expose on reading and writing trauma narratives, Anne Whitehead offers a fascinating engagement with Toni Morrison's notion of jazz as a metaphor for coming to terms with trauma. She imagines being caught in the grip of trauma as a broken record with no choice but to repeat itself at the crack. However, in the terms of the very possibility of making and remaking suggested by jazz, characters in trauma narratives may learn that it is possible to go around again and get out of the groove in which they have been stuck. Whitehead's thoughts on jazz as a metaphor for mitigating the severe effects of trauma on individuals and communities capture well what my recently completed book on reading biblical and contemporary trauma narratives, which includes novels such as The Bookshop, The Handmaid's Tale, Disgrace, The Light Between Oceans, and Milkman. In these novels, in this book of mine, Writing and Reading to Survive, I paired these novels with stories of biblical characters such as Rachel and Leah and their handmaids Bella and Silpah, the daughters of Lot, Ruth and Naomi, Dinah, and woman Zion in the Book of Lamentations. The underlying assumption of this monograph of mine is that by means of telling stories such as these, biblical and contemporary trauma narratives, one may somehow move in the direction of greater insight, greater comfort, greater resilience in the wake of trauma. The past needs no longer be a broken record. In both biblical and contemporary trauma narratives, it's evident that in the context of what Sonia Annemeyer had described as traumatic discordance, in which worldviews and assumptions are ruptured, the application of symbolic language opens up narrative possibility, in which narrative concordance to some extent wrested from traumatic discordance. By reframing traumatic events that are keeping victims captive in a past that they cannot change, it becomes possible for victims to take steps toward claiming their identity as survivors. In this regard, the Book of Ruth is a great example of a later generation facing and revisiting the trauma of the past. Ruth Topher reads the book of Ruth as an example of how unresolved of the trauma of the past came to haunt future generations, as evident in the shocking account of Lot's daughters sleeping with their father in Genesis 19. Topher writes how the characters in Ruth's story once again are faced with annihilation, with men dying one after the other, with a devastating famine that leaves these two widows greatly vulnerable. Returning to the story of another Moabite woman, the earlier painful memory of the story of the Moabite and Ammonite mothers, as narrated in Genesis 19, is invoked once more. The past trauma of the story in Genesis is remembered when Topher reminds us that Moab emerges from within the total reunion of humankind, and 10 generations later, now represented by Ruth, is still in a land facing dire threats to life and reproduction. In light of the surfacing of unresolved traumatic memories, the Book of Ruth may be viewed as another opportunity for the next generation to deal with their traumatic past. These haunting effects of the trauma narrative, as narrated in Genesis 19 and continued in the story of Ruth the Moabite, is brought into sharper relief by means of an engagement with a fascinating novel by Penelope Fitzgerald, The Bookshop. This novel recounts the story of Florence Green, a middle-aged woman who, after the death of her husband, seeks to rebuild her life in the remote town of Hartborough by opening up a bookshop in the old house, which, as will be revealed in the story, proves to be haunted. Read together, these two very interesting trauma narratives with female protagonists who respectively seek to enter a close-knit community to rebuild a shattered life introduce some important themes regarding female agency, the effects of intergenerational trauma, and the ghosts of the past that continue to haunt the next generation. So I first became acquainted with the bookshop in its film version. I was intrigued by the story of this Florence Green, who is described to be very courageous indeed in her quest of opening the only bookshop in the town of Hartborough, sequestered between a river and the sea. Seeking to move beyond mere survival, Florence, almost 20 years after her husband's death, thought this bookshop that sought to bring books and education, and most importantly, a world beyond the insulated town to its inhabitants, is a way also for her to to extend her own survival also to the community as a whole. However, as will be evident in this novel, everyone in Hartborough is not equally receptive to this new venture. Penelope Fitzgerald wrote The Bookshop less than 100 pages in length shortly after the death of her husband, turning that difficult part of her life into a perfectly controlled short novel, funny and profoundly sad. Written by a female author who herself can be said to write her way through some traumatic experiences of her own, writing to survive, The Bookshop introduces a strong female character who is shown in the middle of her valiant attempts of rebuilding a life. What also makes this contemporary trauma narrative an interesting conversation partner for the stories of the Moabite and Ammonite mothers of Genesis 19 and in the Book of Ruth concerns the central theme in the novel of a haunted house with a rambunctious poltergeist. The notion of ghost is a compelling literary feature of trauma fiction in order to illustrate the way in which past traumatic memories come back to haunt the current generation. In addition, the theme of a traumatized woman seeking to rebuild her life amid some serious challenges posed by a community weary of strangers and their strange ideas offers an interesting point of connection between these two trauma narratives from very different times and places. In the first instance, The Bookshop offers a striking portrayal of female agency, of a woman who is seeking to live again after the trauma of losing her husband. After years of merely trying to survive on the meager amount of money left to her by her husband in this dreary town, which is described as having no fish and chips, no laundrette, no cinema, except an alternative Saturday night, Florence Green not only seeks to heal herself, but also the town in which she had been living for some time. The Bookshop furthermore offers an unsettling account of a close-knit but also close-minded community, with many of the townsmen participating in a concerted effort to thwart Florence Green's attempt to establish this new bookshop in the old house. Led by the powerful Mrs. Gamart's resolve to ironically establish an art center in the old house, numerous measures designed to wear Florence down are utilized, but also by others surrounding Mrs. Gamart, even going so far as to mimic Florence Green by opening up another bookshop at Saxe-Foutai. All of these individual and collective measures combined eventually succeed in preventing Florence Green from achieving her goal of establishing a bookshop in the town of Hartboro. In the end, after her books and her car had been dispossessed in order to settle her debts, Florence Green eventually is forced out of town, left without a shop and without books. Unable to sustain the ambiguous relationship with the other, who on the one hand represents the rich world of books and culture and ideas brought to town by Florence Green, ultimately the town closes ranks, shutting the bookshop in the old house forever. Despite the rather tragic ending of the bookshop that documents the severe effects of a community's inability to deal with past trauma, which is connected to closed-mindedness and the expulsion of the other, one finds also an important counter-narrative in this novel that reveals something of an alternative understanding that runs parallel throughout the novel. The other way is presented by the figure of the kind and wise Mr. Brundish, who offers the following assessment of Florence Green. Let me tell you what I admire in human beings. I value most the one virtue which they share with gods and animals, and which need not therefore be referred to as a virtue. I refer to courage. You, Mrs. Green, possesses that quality in abundance. It is Florence Green's courage that offers an interesting point of connection between this contemporary trauma narrative as well as the Book of Ruth that in some sense constitutes a continuation of the account of Florence Green's their father. The point of connection between these contemporary and biblical trauma narratives concerns the way in which the female characters are shown, or rather not shown, to recover from the devastating ordeals that had respectively befallen them. The captivating character of Florence, who 20 years after her husband had died, finally decides to take some definitive actions in order to start a new chapter in her own life, may help us to look anew at the notion of female agency in the interconnected stories of the Moabite Ammonite mothers. Florence Green's courageous example of finally starting to live again may help us to imagine that the two young women in Genesis 19 who saw their world undone and who became mothers that night in the cave of Zoar after getting their father drunk, had to come down the mountain at some point in time to pick up the task of rebuilding a life. It may have taken some time, but at some point these two women conceivably would have entered a new community in which to raise the two babies born out of those most tragic circumstances. Actually, this imaginative act of filling in the interpretive gaps regarding the long and difficult journey towards recovering from trauma is what makes the story of Ruth such an interesting text. At least in the story of Ruth, one finds another Moabite woman who, after the loss of her husband, seeks to rebuild her life by joining the Israelite community of Bethlehem. Nevertheless, Ruth exhibits a strong sense of agency as she decides to travel with Naomi in order to start a new chapter in a new town. Reminiscent of what was said about Florence Green, Ruth can be said to show great courage and resolve, a story encapsulating a hope for a future where things may be better for both her as well as the community which she hopes to join. On one level, one could say that the two women together are successful in carving out a life for themselves. According to Zophar, this Moabite woman, whose hunger is sated 3 times over, she ate, she filled, and she had left over the Ruth 2:14, on a symbolic level may be understood as healing the trauma of the past. Moreover, emerging as the provider who herself had been filled, Ruth can be said to begin to heal the symbolic wound in Naomi's family, but especially in Moab, so conceivably putting to rest at least some of the ghosts of the past. However, Florence Green's story also serves as a reminder that there's not always a direct correlation between the female character's recovery of agency and autonomy and the ultimate interconnected trauma narratives of Ruth, Naomi, and the Ammonite and Moabite mothers of Genesis 19. through the lens of Florence Green's courageous, though incomplete, acts of recovering from their traumatic past, we too, through the act of reading, may give these tragic and yet brave characters a voice. So, a final point of connection, inspired by the engagement with the bookshop, that may be important for reading the biblical trauma narrative, the Moabite and Ammonite mothers, whose story began in Genesis 19 and continues in some fashion in the book of Ruth, is whether these women recovering from trauma will meet a receptive community. This point relates to a much deeper existential and theological issue which runs throughout the biblical traditions. It is, what type of community does Israel want to be? It should be noted that from the very outset, the stories of origin regarding the Ammonites and Moabites have been deeply rooted in expulsion and exclusion. After having resided in the town of Sodom and Gomorrah for years, conceivably without much trouble, Lot and his family presumably were forced to flee when their hospitality to the strangers. Can you see my screen still? It seems like it's gone.
We still see your screen.
Okay, so that's fine. Thank you. So good. Then I'm glad. So after having resided in the town of Sodom and Gomorrah for years, conceivably without much trouble, Lot and his family presumably were forced to flee when their hospitality to the strangers visiting the town resulted in drawing unwarranted attention to themselves. It is clear from the menacing behavior of the townspeople that foreigners are not welcome in towns such as Sodom and Gomorrah. It is also a question in the biblical narratives concerning the Moabite and Ammonite mothers, whether the community that Ruth now is seeking to join will this time be more receptive. Will the town of Bethlehem deal in a more meaningful way with its ambiguous relationship with the stranger in their midst? Perhaps this time around by welcoming the stranger, maybe letting the other in on his or her own terms, and so rectifying the abjection of the despised, disgusting other. The stakes are high indeed. The disastrous consequences of failing to deal with the past is something of which Ruth's contemporaries, Ezra and Nehemiah, may attest all too well. Whether this book of Ruth succeeds or not is an open debate. Some scholars argue that Ruth so successfully is integrated into the community that she all but disappears. Even her son ends up being adopted by Naomi. In this regard, Ruth is viewed as the model immigrant, the good native who has to give up her identity as a Moabite woman in order to fit in. In a related argument, Carolyn Sharp describes the relationship between Ruth and Naomi in terms of the economy of exploitation. In Sharp's view, Naomi callously exploits Ruth for economic gain and reinforces the patriarchal notion of Ruth's body as a source of field labor, or even worse, a producer of children. As he describes the relationship between these women that so often is couched in terms of loyalty or steadfast love. Fidelity, I see only manipulation, commodification, and erasure. The same narrative is read through in a very different way by Jacqueline Lapsley, who views a central theme in this narrative as the restoration of Naomi to a life of meaningful relationships, with each of the characters, including Naomi herself, having the task to pick up the threads of that life and weave them back into community. Restoration is not only the task of the characters, but in an important sense, it's the goal of the narrative as a whole. The sharp divergence in scholarly opinion on whether the Book of Ruth reflects a restored community or further exploitation of the Moabite underscores the complexity and ambiguity associated with trauma fiction in general. Perhaps the way in which the bookshop is able to hold a counter-narrative in tension with the principal storyline, which, even though it may not be the dominant voice, remains there to show an alternative view of the world, may be helpful for considering the ambiguities in terms of the Book of Ruth. This counter-story, lifted up especially by Lapsley's reading above, is to be found in the examples of kindness represented in, for instance, the figure of Boaz, whose generosity extends to both the Moabite widow, Ruth, as well as Naomi. And one sees also kindness reflected in the figure of the Moabite sojourner Ruth, whose courage as a Eshet Chayil, literally a strong woman, is praised in what she offers, both to Naomi, but also to this new community which she has sought to enter. So in conclusion, the trauma narratives featured in these presentations have in common that none of them exhibit a typically and they lived happily ever after ending. This is certainly true in the case of the original trauma narrative in Genesis 19, in which the mothers of the Moabites and Ammonites disappear without the reader knowing how or even whether they recovered from the harrowing ordeal they had experienced. And in terms of the ambiguity as to whether Ruth the Moabite had ultimately succeeded in being healed herself, as well as healing the community's fraught relationship with their Moabite and Ammonite neighbors, also has been shown to be inconclusive. At least the fact that another story of a Moabite woman made it into the canon could be viewed as a positive sign, though one should also note that no such story regarding the Ammonites exists, which in itself may be revealing. In the case of Florence Green, the rather bleak ending of the bookshop may perhaps offer some insight into the interconnected trauma narratives of the Ammonite and Moabite mothers in Genesis 19 as it spills over into the Book of Ruth. On one level, the failure of the main character to be restored into the community could be read as an inability to overcome her traumatic past. However, as Christopher Knight poignantly writes about the bookshop, which he describes to be the saddest of Penelope Fitzgerald's novels, the bookshop works on the edge of despair, though it does not succumb to that despair, and thus might in the end be more fittingly thought an instance of melancholia, wherein the author and the protagonist are found working through loss toward that point wherein they can, at least theoretically, imagine consolation. Nevertheless, the underlying assumption of reading trauma narratives is that by means of stories, as was introduced in this presentation and my book as a whole, one may somehow move in the direction of greater insight, greater comfort, greater resilience in the wake of trauma, so that the past no longer is a broken record. In this regard, so we've seen in the creative engagement between biblical and contemporary narrative, that this may serve as a productive means for considering both the debilitating effects of trauma on the traumatized characters, but at the same time help victims move out of the groove in which they have been stuck. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. We appreciate, and yes, we still have some, I think, 8 minutes time we at the end we have got ample time for discussion as well, but we still have a few minutes before the next speaker starts. So is there perhaps a question to Julie now? I think the best way is that you just unmute yourself and just introduce yourself and ask the question. Otherwise, you're also welcome to pose a question on the show conversation. Yeah, if you want to ask a question, we've got a few minutes left before we introduce the next speaker. Any questions or comments or remarks or yeah?
Thank you, Prof. It's Zooks on this side. Thank you so much for unpacking to us. I just want to ask a question. You mentioned, I'm not sure whether I captured you correctly, about the traumas of the past not defining the present and the future. Can you reflect more on that? Because I don't seem to fully understand you, is that whether the traumas of the past should not be dealt in a way that they will define the future, or how did you put it, if you may?
Yes, and so in the introduction to my book, I also speaks a lot about the effects of trauma on the psyche. Sort of this is wonderful book, Bessel van der Kolk, that talks about the body keeps the score, and how one's body sort of reacts as a result of trauma, and also insidious trauma that's ongoing, that's especially women or people in oppressive situations experience. But what happens if one does not deal with the trauma of the past? If one sort of just almost do not want to go there, do not want to talk about it, it's like a wound. Shelley Rambo also speaks about this wounds that fester. So it becomes infected. And then what happens, it erupts in a later generation. So especially for intergenerational trauma. And I think, for us as a country, because we have not adequately dealt with the trauma of the past, it comes back to haunt us. And, it's some of these trauma authors like Toni Morrison, but some of the others really speak with Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. And the whole main character is a ghost, because sort of how the past sort of comes to haunt the community in the future. So symbolic language is often easier to tell a story or to use almost a metaphor or symbol, because it's a bit further removed from sort of speaking directly about what's the pain. It's almost too difficult to speak about the pain. So and that is what I think stories can help us to deal with the trauma of the past. And I think we all may have had that experience of reading a novel or watching a film, and something in there resonates so much with you and helps you to give new perspective on your own life. It's interesting. I mean, one of the chapters of my book also deals with reproductive loss. And I mean, there's not a lot written in the biblical text about miscarriage or stillbirth or infertility. There's written, but always has a happy ending when the matriarchs get a child, or a child is given, or Hannah is given a child. But I mean, sort of really what the effect is on women, but also couples and whole communities. So, there's this wonderful novel, Life Between the Oceans, that speaks so beautifully and candidly in a story form, also about miscarriage and stillbirth and infertility and loss. And by reading that becomes such an interesting way, a conversation starter, helping for us others to to link up and to be able to connect with some of these characters' lives. That it gives you new insight also into your own experience as well. So Zoek, and that's sort of meaning sort of having to deal with the trauma of the past. Otherwise, one live what scholars also talk a half-life, cannot really flourish, can't get ahead, stuck. And I think that's what story is helping us also to do.
Thanks again. I see there's a question. You can perhaps look at that as well.
Yes.
But you can, at the end, there's a question in the conversation, so you can look at that and about Ruth. So you're very welcome to answer that.
I'll look at that and then I can answer.
Look at it at the end as well. So we see Marius also in the picture here. So Marius, welcome. It's nice to have you. Also a friend of the Winter School. I've been involved with the Winter School for the past few years as well. So Marius is a professor in New Testament at the faculty of Stellenbosch, and he is also connected as a minister to the DRC Oosterseer, where his wife serves as a minister. So he knows something about the academic life, but also about the practical life in a congregation. So welcome, Marius. And after 25 minutes, I will just tell you 5 minutes left. So welcome. We're looking forward also.
Danny, I just want to check, can people see me? I seem to be slightly hidden on my own little camera.
I see you clearly. I hope the other people as well, and I can hear you clearly as well.
And can you hear me clearly as well? So Corix, thank you for the invite and participating. This is always like this scary moment to see if I can actually share my screen. How does this work again? I think it's this one. Let's see if it opens up. It's turning around in circles, and I'm just gonna. Okay, there it is. Can everybody see my slide?
Yes, I can see it now on my screen. Yes.
And Danny, I'm just gonna close my window because it's open to where the people are parking and driving and talking. So I'm just gonna close that.
So do you close that because you wait for the apocalypse, or
Yeah, wait a minute. So this is actually something that bothered me more last year than this year, because when I was preparing for the Winter School for last year, I was thinking about this whole notion of the apocalypse. And if we think back to the theme of the whole conference, the whole Winter School, it is hope with a question mark, and this sort of triggered in me the question of what type of hope are we talking about? Because you get different types of hope, and it's informed by different things. And this whole notion of the church as an alternative community in a time of disruption. So as soon as you start adding hope to alternative community and disruption, if that's your mixture in the New Testament, that sort of boils down to apocalyptic thinking. So that's where my sort of reflection on this theme came from. And it was also informed by personal observations and stuff that I was reading at that time. So the first one that was interesting for me was it's something that I noticed when every time my children or my family suggest something I should watch on Netflix or any place, I became very sort of aware of the fact of how many, I think the fancy word is dystopian stories are out there. And when I read the New York Times, they mentioned this, where they said modern secular American life is filled with its own apocalyptic visions. Movies and television shows depict civilization on the brink of extinction. And then there's a whole list of them: The Walking Dead, The Hunger Games, and it almost seems to me, if you go through the Netflix sort of suggestions for the week, that there's usually at least one or two shows in this selection that they sort of say you should actually have a look at and binge watch, that are what I would call secular apocalyptic visions. In other words, it depicts a world that is either on the brink of disaster or after a major disaster, and it usually sort of creates a society that is very, very sort of disrupted by what has happened. So I was thinking about this whole notion, and this article in the New York Times sort of confirmed what I was seeing in my own personal life. And then of the whole pandemic, and also the period before this, going to the economic crisis and all the broader crises in Africa, this same article in the New York Times, looking at America, so it's a different context than our own, mentioned that 44% of likely voters in the United States, that's a large percentage of people in what we would consider to be a quite affluent, developed society, we're looking at stuff like the coronavirus and the economic meltdown as a sign of God's coming judgment. And I was also reading other stuff where especially in the States, less so in South Africa, people were sort of almost talking about this whole pandemic and what has befallen us in apocalyptic terms. And I'll explain now what I mean by apocalyptic. So the one thing that I would want to check with those of the people online and in different congregations in different contexts is, does this also reflect what's happening in South African society? Because if you monitor this in sort of the comments column of newspapers and stuff, every now and then, usually after 11 o'clock at night, when people are commenting on what they're reading and what they're seeing, somebody sneaks a comment past the editors that's not picked up by Network 24 or News 24 or wherever, that has sort of this notion of this is actually wonderful that this virus has now struck us, because it's a sign of God's judgment. It's a sign that we are now in new times. Society as it is now being judged. And you sort of get a sort of apocalyptic sense in it. So this is the whole notion of why I thought it's important to look at apocalyptic. Because apocalyptic eschatology being our understanding, our theology of the end things, the final things, how will everything end. And apocalyptic eschatology is a subset of eschatology, and it reflects a particular kind of hope. And that particular kind of hope determines how we sort of live our lives in the present. The 1 year I was in the southern part of America attending a conference, and I was riding a bus, and in front of me there was a guy in a pickup truck. And those of you who've been to America will know there's a lot of theology on bumper stickers in America. People buy bumper stickers and they sort of proclaim stuff. And some of them are actually, you have to sit down and think what the person is saying when they put it on. So one of the popular ones that I saw was, it said something in the line of, be careful, because in the time of the rapture or after the rapture, this motor vehicle will be unmanned, which sort of depicts this notion of the rapture, which sort of fits into this apocalyptic thinking. But then there was another one, and this pertains to this notion of that if apocalypticism is a type of hope, that it determines our conduct. It said the following, and this is, I think, in response to legislature that the Americans were considering to ban extra drilling for oil, and this is now the south of America, oil country, and the bumper sticker said, "Drill, baby, drill, because it's going to burn anyway." In other words, why look after the earth? Why care about conserving the earth if it's going to be judged by God and destroyed in fire in sort of an apocalyptic judgment on creation? Why would you preserve the world if it's going to fall away? So your apocalyptic hope determines how you conduct yourself in the present. And in this New York article that I've referenced before, there's this good, I think, summary of why it sometimes boils to the surface. And it's this notion of a stark binary structure. I mean, apocalypticism usually has this very clear binary structure, us against them, good against bad, good and evil. There's no middle ground. There's no gray in it. It's clear and it's stark. This type of thinking, good against bad, clear before and after, usually comes to the fore when society starts to fracture, when the governing consensus that keeps people together, and this also refers to people of faith, starts to fracture. It's a symptom of society fracturing. So looking at the Americans, I'm quite clear that there is at least some strands of this in certain particular church denominations, maybe more than others, but this could also be our future. It could be a secular apocalyptic, in other words, that people just watch the movies for entertainment and they've got sort of a general sense of the whole world is dystopian, or it could have a religious flavor to it. And I'm not so sure how deep this religious flavor runs in South Africa. That's something that we can discuss when we talk about this what I put on the table. So apocalypticism and the New Testament. So that's my field of study, not apocalypticism, but the New Testament. Let's have a look at what we can glean from this and how this can inform our theology and our practice. So obviously the whole depiction of a whole genre of literature as being apocalyptic actually comes from the Apocalypse of John, the first few verses of the Apocalypse of John, where it's the first time that we find that a body of literature, or in this case a particular book, is depicted as being an apocalypse. In other words, that the Greek word meaning revelation or disclosure is not an unknown word, but it had not been applied to a particular document before we find this in the Revelation of John. This does not mean that the type of literature did not exist. It only means that it was not characterized as such. So we know that apocalyptic literature amongst the Jews especially arose in the intertestamental period, mostly as a response to Hellenism and the continuing conflict between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies after the death of Alexander the Great, which resulted in the Seleucids and Epiphanes IV being unbelievably cruel towards the Jews. And in that particular period, we find apocalyptic literature coming to the fore. And what we see in the Gospel, the Revelation of John, is a very clear sort of almost depiction of what we would call the core characteristics of apocalyptic literature. You have a particular message, a revelation that's given by God through a chain of revelation in Revelation 1, but it's usually God giving a revelation to a particular person via some sort of mediator, an otherworldly mediator. And this pertains usually to future events, and there's usually some sort of warning to it. So it's interesting, this is a religious apocalypticism. In secular apocalyptic stories that you would see on Netflix or on other places, you usually have some sort of either aliens or highly sophisticated technology or some sort of supernatural element that sort of goes with the apocalyptic story. It's very seldom that it's just a pure change in history. In other words, there's not something otherworldly to the storyline. So in the 80s, there was a 70s, resulting in the 80s publications, there was a study to try and define what is meant by apocalypse, and you will see this is informed by John 1 verse 1 to 2, and it defines apocalypse as a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework. In other words, it needs to have a storyline, that it has some sort of message that you have to react to, and this whole mediation, I think, is the important thing. There's either an angel or some sort of non-human agent giving the message. And what you do get the sense of is that you get a depiction or a view of society or reality that's different from one that you would get from within history. You are sort of invited to look at reality from God's perspective. And this refers to reality in a temporal sense, what's going to happen in the future, and in a spatial sense. In other words, you get a depiction of what's happening in the realm that's not usually accessible to humans. So the Revelation is basically the only book that we have in the Bible that's in its entirety and belongs to this genre, but we have smaller subunits. Even in the Old Testament, I think Daniel 7 to 12 is usually depicted as having apocalyptic elements to it. We see this also in passages like Mark 13 that has aspects of this. So it was a later development, probably during the Hellenistic period, that started to influence the religion of Judaism. So, recapping. What happens with apocalyptic, and how does this pertain to hope, and how does this pertain to us as a particular community of faith? The one is that it usually arises in a time of crisis. It can be a sharp crisis, like the destruction of the temple, or it can be the result of a pressure that builds up over a period, a lingering sort of pressure. I think Hellenism would be an example of this, where you have cultural pressure, political pressure, at some stage even religious pressure, and people start reflecting and responding to this pressure over an extended period of time with a particular sort of body of literature. And we see this also in the New Testament as a response to the Roman Emperor. And it usually arises in a particular community of people that feel that when they look at dominant culture, the culture that they're embedded in, that they cannot identify with the values of that culture, that they feel alienated from that culture. And I think this sense of alienation is the important thing to pick up. And we see this with the Jews being alienated within the Hellenistic period, and we see this with the early Christians experiencing themselves to be alienated within the Roman Empire. And this sense of alienation, I think, is the important thing to pick up if we look at secular apocalyptic thinking. Where people, especially younger generations, it appears, feel themselves alienated from the world that they are sort of born into. They feel that the world doesn't offer them hope. They struggle to identify with the values of this world, and they can't see this world changing. It's an irredeemable world. What they basically see is something needs to happen that almost wipes this world. With world, I now mean the culture, the politics, the whole network off the table, and something new needs to be put on the table. So they start creating a totally new value system, and this whole new value system, usually of a very small group, for them is the only solution. You cannot redeem society. You have to withdraw from society, and what you basically see is a radical break between society and this group. So my sense is, in the circles that I move around, I don't often bump into this sort of thinking within congregations. In other words, that you would have 10, 15 people in a particular congregation saying to yourself, we need to climb a mountain and isolate ourselves from the world and pray for the destruction of Cape Town, because Cape Town is such a vile place. What I do see this when I bump into people and read columns on my Facebook page and places, is isolated individuals that feel themselves pushed to the margins of society. They can't identify with the values of the society, and that they almost form an isolated group, or a group of people on the internet that share a sense of alienation. They don't have a coherent value system for themselves, but they are sort of finding themselves. And then there is this notion that they start creating symbols that sort of speak to themselves. And maybe we can speak about that in the process. So why is this important? Well, if we as a faith community, followers of Jesus, want to think about our response to the world that we're in the world of discord, the world of strife and conflict, then obviously apocalyptic thinking is one of the varieties of hope that's on the table. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, is it a legitimate one? And is it a legitimate one, not in the sense that it speaks to our own personality, but does it speak to what we find in the text that we read, and does it sort of align with the message of Jesus? And with the message of Jesus, I'm not talking about the historical Jesus. And it's interesting that if you read the whole discussion on the quest for the historical Jesus for the last 200 years, it's basically guided by this question: is what was the intent of Jesus? And to what extent was he an apocalyptic prophet? So what you usually tend to see in the literature is that within sort of European liberal thinking and the progressives of that, there's a notion that you can strip Jesus down to sort of a social prophet. In other words, he sees society as it is as redeemable if society buys into certain core values, usually liberal values. So if we just are kind to outsiders, if we accept everybody, if we especially focus on the poor, we can create a new society that's just and open to everybody. This goes back to the original thinkers within European historical Jesus research, but it's also sort of common currency. It's someone like Dominique Crossan, for instance, say the intent of Jesus was to create a society, what he calls a brokerless society. In other words, to get access to the good stuff of life, what you need to live, you are not indebted to patrons and people that you have to please in order to get access to security, to food, to grace, to God's presence, that you can have immediate access to this. So this is like we just engage with society, and we can redeem society almost in a evolutionary manner. There's no need to sort of turn our back on society. It's hard work, but it's possible. But then there's another tradition that says, well, if you really look at what we find in the Gospels, then we do find apocalyptic thinking in Jesus. And it goes back to the Schweitzer line. Albert Schweitzer had said, well, what Jesus actually wanted to do was, I'm paraphrasing now, but create a crisis that forces God to intervene and sort of bring the wheels of history to a stop. That he is a purely apocalyptic prophet, that he did not think society is redeemable in the sense of just doing good stuff over an extended period of time and making it more liberal and more open to people. It needs to be shocked. It needs to be brought. It needs to be almost brought to an end. You need to force God to intervene. So what we often see, if we look at our own church denominations, that we tend to err to the one side of this. That we either have a very strong emphasis on that Jesus has engaged with society, that is not standing, that does not want to sort of stop history and stop the development of society, but it's actively engaged in changing society. And then you have people that say, well, society is basically gone to the dogs. We can just pray that God intervenes and stops it. What we need to take seriously, however, is that the depictions of Jesus in the three synoptic Gospels and even John do have strong apocalyptic elements to it. And we need to ask ourselves, what happens if we just sort of skip over those elements? Can we do that? Can we just sort of ignore those elements that are part of our New Testament? So what we often see is that in the sort of church circles that I move around in is that people tend to avoid talking about judgment, because judgment is usually a central part of apocalyptic thinking, that God comes and he judges over the good and the bad, the evil and his people. That's a sort of schism and separation. So it will be interesting to see if judgment is. I was thinking the other day, when was the last time I've had somebody really seriously talk about judgment, and what does it mean that the Bible talks about judgment? Because for if you read the Gospels especially, judgment is part of the good news. I mean, it's the way that God's justice is finally established. You can't skip past it. So the question is then, if we take some aspects of this apocalyptic thinking seriously, how do we use it? Is it an opium that sort of tells people, well, the world is a crazy, terrible place, but we can do nothing about this world? The best you can do is grin and bear it. I mean, take your medicine and hope for the best, that when God intervenes, everything will be fixed. But up to then, just almost like opium, the Marxist criticism of Christianity, just use your drugs and chill out. Or is it like an adrenaline that sort of stimulates you to do something? And I think that's the two questions. Because in what I think we find in the New Testament is that it is a stimulant. It's not a sedative, apocalyptic thinking. It does actually ask you to do something that you need to do. But then we also need to be very careful that we should not weaponize this. What we tend to do of apocalyptic thinking, and we see this also in apocalyptic text, is that we tend to assume uncritically that we are God's people, that we are in the right and other people are not. And that they must sort of prepare themselves to be judged. So we use this thinking not to reflect critically about our own conduct and our own hope. We tend to use it as a stick to hit other people with. And I think that's a crazy thing to do. We have to ask ourselves, what's our position before God? Then the last one is something just for further studies, because I'm not so quite clear in my mind about this, is how did the New Testament think about this whole notion of the renewal of creation, because you have got different streams in the New Testament. Is it the destruction of everything that exists and a new heaven and new earth, recreation in other words, or is it a transformation of what is? So are we working with God in the direction of transformation, or are we basically waiting for recreation after the destruction of this reality? It will be interesting to sort of explore that, and maybe that's a topic for a PhD study. So I think the thing that I want to put on the table is that apocalyptic thinking has this dualism inherent to it. And it's a danger to this dualism because it is simplistic. It doesn't leave gray areas. But there is something to think about if you lose one of the polarities in the dualism, that it does open up your theology to be reductionistic. So if you just preach salvation and never mention judgment, then there's a reductionism in that. The opposite is also true. If you just focus on what is good and bad and you think you're good and other people are bad, that's also reductionistic. If we just consider people to be sinners, in other words, they just have to sit around and waiting for the judgment of God, that's also reductionistic. If we just think everybody is redeemed and basically have to be accepted as such, that would also, in a sense, be reductionistic. So I think what apocalyptic thinking does with its polarities that underlies its dualism is it does give you something to ask yourself, well, all of us have usually got one pole of the polarity that speaks to our theology and speaks to our personality and speaks to our worldview. So I think the challenge is to ask yourself, okay, what happens when I consider the other one? And not just push it to the side, but actually actively consider it. So for instance, I think if somebody did an analysis of what I tend to preach, I tend to err on the grace side. But okay, that is wonderful and fine, and it's part of the Gospels, but there's also other texts that speak about, well, about judgment. So what would happen if I seriously consider that? Doesn't that broaden my understanding of the message of the Bible? I've already spoken about the whole notion of weaponizing Christianity, where you use Christianity to nail the people you don't like. But it can also be pacified. In other words, that it's sort of say, well, we actually need to do nothing. So one suggestion is Michael Gorman has written a little small book, which I think is quite a good one, on reading Revelation responsibly. And I always want to paraphrase and say, using apocalyptic thinking responsibly. Because obviously Revelation is our prime example in the New Testament of apocalyptic literature. So what would happen if we take this seriously and use it responsibly? And he has a number of suggestions. I think it's 4 of them. So the first thing that he says is Revelation, and I would then paraphrase and say apocalyptic thinking, invites us to look and listen. So what he basically says about the book of Revelation is, he says this is a book of visions and auditions, stuff you hear. It invites us to cast our eyes onto the Lamb that was slaughtered. It calls us to see him both the way to God, and the way of God. In other words, that through the Lamb we enter into God's presence, and the manner of the Lamb. In other words, being slaughtered and not slaughtering. That is the way of God. We meditate on the atoning character of his death, but also on his faithful witness in that death. We open our ears individually and corporately to the Spirit who is constantly speaking to the church. Then the second set, worship and witness, referring again to Revelation, but this is also typical of apocalyptic literature. This is a book of hymns and liturgies. So we offer our praise to God and to the Lamb night and day. We pledge our allegiance to the one who alone is worthy of it. We allow our praise and the vision of God and the Lamb that inspires it to infect and affect everything we think, say, and do. And we tell others about the one who alone is worthy of their worship and allegiance to. Our witness consists of action, not just of words. So if we take apocalyptic thinking seriously, that Christ is the judge, then we have to worship him and witness to this fact. Then I've got 2 more slides. This is the pre-ultimate one. Come out and resist. This is a book, again, Revelation, of prophetic challenge and uncomfortable demands, because most of us, understandably, like what empire claims to offer. And empires, I think we have our own empires today. We like security, purpose, victory, control of history, sacred honor, duty, and blessing. And we are willing to offer our minds, hearts, and bodies in return. So I think we have to be honest about this. Apocalyptic thinking, again, is not just directed at other people, it's directed at us. It's directed to the faith community. And we have to ask ourselves, don't we too easily buy into empire? With our vision corrected by the Lamb and our focus on him, we seek next to disengage our minds, hearts, and bodies from all that promises life, but delivers death. All that promises life but delivers death. We need to resist the seduction of normalcy and civil religion and engage the world in new ways and on new terms. So this would be a new hope that apocalyptic thinking places on the table. And the last one is follow. We follow the Lamb. We seek to follow him out of empire into the new creation, but also paradoxically into empire, into the dark corners of empire, those places where the vision of God and the Lamb is most needed, where death needs to be replaced with life, where we can bear witness in word and deed to the coming new creation, creation where there will be life-giving water for all, the end of pain and tears, and healing for individuals and nations. We follow him into a new heaven and new earth, liberated from the effects of our sin and even from sin itself, alive with the perpetual presence of the living God, in whom we can both be lost and found in eternal wonder, awe and praise. Living faithfully in light of that vision is no small challenge. So to finish off, I think we are living in times where people do have elements of apocalyptic thinking, or I would almost say apocalyptic escapism, in the sense that they like media or movies or stories that are dystopian. But it's escapism. It doesn't change our reality. It offers nothing more than a few hours of being engaged with a story and saying, well, at least our world is not that bad, or identifying with a hero or a heroine. But that sort of secular eschatology, that's basically pure escapism, does not really help us as a faith community to be reorientated and pointed toward this world as a symbol of hope. So I think if we re-engage with the apocalypticism that's in the New Testament, like Coleman does in his last few slides, then it's something different. It's something that's directed at us. It's not a stick to eat the world with, but it is a guideline that asks us as a faith community to reevaluate the polarities with which we are comfortable with, that we've sort of bought into, and to broaden the scope of what we engage with. And that, in that sense, then we engage with the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mari. We really appreciate. And we can, at the end, we have time for discussion, about 30 minutes. So we'll continue with our next speaker. Our next speaker is Peter Nagel. I think, is Peter there? Peter, are you there?
I think the rapture got Peter.
Oh no, I know where he is. He's with the sermons. So you have to you have to give him a minute. Because I
Okay.
mean, he's wrapping up with
So it's
us.
wrapping up. Okay, perhaps we can have then one question to Marius. Michal, you will try to find Peter, or I think you will try to.
I think he may have just joined.
Okay,
If I'm mistaken.
perhaps
Yes, he's here now.
is here. Okay, Peter. He says, "I am here." Okay, Peter.
Wonderful.
It looks like you've been in a. So very welcome, Peter Nagel. He's also a friend of the Winter School and been involved with the Winter School for the past few years. He's a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Theology at Stellenbosch, and he's specializing in New Testament and Septuagint studies. So welcome, Peter, and yeah, we're looking forward to this session. It's 30 minutes, so after 25 minutes, I will just tell you it's 25 minutes. Thanks very much.
I'm going to be sure. I cannot believe that you invited me back after all the things I've said thus far at the Winter School, but it's amazing. It's amazing. So thank you for the opportunity again. I hope there's more than 5 minutes for reflection, because I think it's necessary.
No, sorry, at the end we've got 30 minutes altogether. So yeah, I will.
Okay,
yeah,
great stuff.
So you've got 30 minutes, and then at the end 30 minutes altogether for the 3 speakers.
Okay, so the topic here is: does the church perpetuate violence disguised as hope? It is important for me to be upfront with you how I came up with this question and why I'm asking it. In one of my modules I teach, 1 Peter, among other general epistles, form the subject matter of the module. This allows me, myself and the students, to engage the text in more depth. As I read about hope and a call to exemplary holy living as servants of God, I started wondering whether this is not selling expensive theology to poor slaves. I felt uncomfortable with the slaves that are called to accept the authority of their masters. There was a discomfort in the words to be aware of God while enduring suffering, unjustly so. Let me be honest. What I'm about to share with you today is a genuine concern. It's something that deeply troubles me, and I cannot simply ignore it. Does the church perpetuate violence disguised as hope is not a title for the purpose of marketing value. It is an honest, real question I have. My stance on the matter is the following. Many different ethnic groups might have been liberated to some degree, but the theology of the churches of apartheid still reigns supreme. People need to be liberated, in my view, from the theology of apartheid. And no, I'm not referring to the apartheid ideology disguised as theology. I'm referring to the essentials of Protestant theology. And I'm generalizing, please. I'm not saying all the theology, but there are some theologies within Protestantism that is keeping people captured, and they need to be liberated from it, at least in my view. I'm here referring to violence disguised as hope. I'm not suggesting that my view is beyond reproach, obviously not, but it's my view and I would like to share it with you today. So let us, and the text, I mean, this is a text we worked on, and is 1 Peter 2, 18 to 3:22. So I've chosen this to as an example of this type of theologies that we need to be liberated from. Slaves and the example of Christ. Isn't this type of theology ideal for a white supremacist privileged perpetrator like myself? Forget about economic freedom and liberation. This theology seems to perpetuate the notion of accepting the abusive, unequal relationship between the slave and master. In fact, it is brilliantly strategic. This is calling on the slave to embrace his virtue virtuous identity because it mirrors the suffering Christ. And I quote, by his wounds you have been healed. So let us not talk about anger, frustration, the need for true liberation of the heart, mind, soul, and spirit. And what is this about land? Embrace your suffering as it is less unjust compared to the suffering of Christ. And I want to repeat this. Embrace your suffering as it is less unjust compared to the Christ suffering. Now, as the exemplary perpetrator, this theology fits me perfectly. I mean, I have no one standing up against me, wanting to fight, wanting to hurt me, wanting to just vent frustration. They are subdued because Christ has already suffered. And I mean, you cannot top that. At least accept the fact that you are less than Christ, and your suffering is but a mirror image. As with my suffering, of course, that's a different story. I don't need to mirror Christ, not for now, at least, according to this theology. The second point, wives, accept the authority of your husbands. And yes, the woe of man and the fear of males. Seek and find your inner strength and beauty. Be gentle and quiet. This is so precious to God. It is clear what happens when you braid your hair. I do apologize. When you braid your hair, sorry, can I just get a sip of water? Sorry about this. I think my wife heard me say these words and she put something in my coffee. But anyway, I'm back and I've got some water. Be gentle and quiet. This is so precious to God. It is clear what happens when you braid your hair, wear golden ornaments, and dress the way you do. You become a victim of a sexual crime. Be content with your innermost self. You are the weaker sex. You are heirs of the gracious gift of life. Well, to be real, beating, brutally violated, raped, abused. But let these things not hinder your prayers. Just hush, hope in God, and accept your subordinate fate. I just simply cannot read this text without feeling extremely uncomfortable. The theology embedded here is something I personally cannot identify myself with. And it has to be brought to the fore. It has to be put out there and be scrutinized. We cannot simply accept these words and do exegetical gymnastics to soften this. What is being presented here should, in my view, not be acceptable. We need to be liberated from theologies such as these, at least the embedded theology that I read. Unity in the Spirit. Let us unite. Let us forget about the injustice of the past. And please do not repay evil with evil, abuse with abuse. Please accept the status quo. because blessing awaits you. Let me just repeat this. As somebody that represents a historical and still present perpetrator, someone with a privilege list longer than an A4 page. This is convenient theology, to say the least. For me, that is. Let us unite, let us forget about the injustice of the past. Let bygones be bygones. And please do not repay evil with evil. Please not. I mean, and abuse with abuse. Just accept the fact that some, suffered, and, we have heard it by now. There is the Christ, remember, that suffered more. And that was more unjust than any suffering. So just accept. Please accept the status quo, because blessing awaits you. Maybe not today. Let's be fair and honest about it. So yes, time will pass, and this blessing, you might not experience it now. So liberation is in a certain sense there, but on many levels, these theologies just keep some at bay, and to just accept their fate, because someday, somewhere in the future, you will be blessed. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday, somewhere, somehow. You might die of hunger while waiting for this blessing. You might die of for the lack of proper medical care. You might die of domestic violence. You might be killed. But I mean, it's all for a good cause, isn't it? It's to hope for something that is there in the future. And if you can't see it, if you can't experience that, if that is not something tangible, something you can identify with, at least there's Christ that suffered. And you can at least hold on to that you suffer as Christ suffered. So do what is good. And if you suffer for doing good, for turning the other cheek, and please allow me to remind you to just turn the other cheek. That's a theology that we so desperately need today. I personally don't need somebody that, repays evil with evil and abuse with abuse. Can you imagine what will happen to me? So please just turn the other cheek. This is the type of theology that we desperately need. Wait for it. You will eventually be blessed. Just sanctify the Lord and ignore this nonsense of retribution, economic freedom. The price is simply too high. There is, and of course, the quest for unity. Now, that's a virtuous cause. Let us focus on the things that unite us, that brings us together, like the suffering of Christ and these niceties of our Christian theologies. There is simply too much at stake. It's better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will. They are all united under Jesus as the Christ, who sits on the right hand of God with the angels authorities, and powers. Your reward awaits you, and one day in the heavens above. But for God's sake, stop moaning about the past and how it affects the present. Let us hope for a better tomorrow. No, let us hope and live towards the heavenly reward, for it will be sweet. It's a theology that does not liberate. It is a theology, in my view, that perpetuates violence, not hope. I'm of the view that the embedded, inferred, and widely used theology of 1 Peter is one of the biggest liberating challenges we face in this country. It is disguised hope. It is hope that is covering up pain, a sense of anger, frustration, disorientation, disbelief, disempowerment. I truly hope I'm wrong, but I have a strong suspicion that I'm right. If not accepting this theology is wrong, then I do not want to be right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. We still have 15 minutes before we start with the general discussion. So yes, Peter, is there a question? You welcome. Also, just unmute yourself and introduce yourself and pose a question to Peter, or a comment, anything. I see a hand from Prof. Klute. You're welcome to raise a question.
Yes, I'm here for Peter, né? Hi, Peter. I just want to ask Peter, in terms of if you jump from reading the text to theology, right? What happens in between? What lens do you use to get to that theology? Is it a literally interpretation of the text? Or how do you sort of conclude that that is, I mean, I like what you say. I do agree in a certain sense that that's a possibility that's very big and very dangerous, right? But I just want to understand your process in terms of having the text and immediately sort of just having this theology. Can you just assist me there?
Anita, thanks for the question. And let me just say that it's not an immediate jump to a theology. So I want to make it clear that it's not simply a reading of the text and then I move over and construct a theology. My process is to a read and a rereading of the text, and to sensitize myself to the theology that and obviously I'm the reader, so I am constructing, let's be honest about it, but there's embeddedness, a theological embeddedness that I'm picking up. It's an intuitive reading of the text, you know, so trying to make sense of the text, reading and rereading the text. I think it's plausible that such a theology can be constructed and inferred based on this text. But of course, it's open for scrutiny. So just to answer your question, it's a reading and a rereading of the text, and it doesn't happen all of a sudden. It's a process.
I see two other hands. Sipiwe, you're welcome.
Thank you, Danny. To Peter, I also like what you are saying, and as someone who would lean more towards liberation theology, it makes more sense to me. But I just have one question for you. When you say we need to be liberated from these theologies, which in your view are not helpful, can you offer some practical ways in which ordinary folk can be liberated from such texts in the Bible? So in other words, how does a person read this text and still be liberated from it after reading it?
Thank you for the question, and that's a difficult one. In my position, the responsibility of attempting to liberate starts with me, and within my church denomination to place it on the agenda, to take it into congregations, and not to simply accept the theologies that are commonplace. And I'm generalizing here, please. I'm not saying every single congregation in this country is their theologies are perpetuating violence disguised as hope. We are all sinister and, planning. There's something hidden beneath. This is not what I'm saying. I think it's just to, and it starts with me. It starts with my family. Moving in these Dutch Reformed spaces. It starts with my mother. It starts with conversations there. And that, so firstly, I feel I need to be liberated from the theologies that made who I am. And then I could offer some form of solution, or not a solution, but a process of what we can do in our congregations to liberate people. I hope it makes sense. I don't have a definite answer to it, but it's conversations on conversations, and it simply starts with me.
Okay, I see also a comment there. It's helpful. Thanks, Peter. I see also a hand from Prophet Julie Klaassen. Julie?
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. I love what you're doing, and I think you're in good company. I mean, sort of maybe to respond to both the previous speakers, Anita, I mean, this what he's doing there is sort of very much related also to what feminist, post-colonial, queer interpreters do. I mean, it's all in the scope of liberation theology, but it's reading text of terror, text of harmful theologies. It's based in sort of what Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza already, almost 40 years ago, 30 years, when was it, 19, when the ethics of biblical interpretation, sort of time flies. But when she sort of said, I mean, that it matters, our reading matters, and we need to take responsibility for our readings. We cannot, I mean, in her presidential address that she had sort of in 1993 or when it was that, but she spoke about, I mean, looked at all the presidents of the Society of Biblical Literature and how they spoke about the biblical text as if there's not world wars going on or injustices in the world in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of poverty, in terms of homophobia. And I think that is our task. What I, at least, as a biblical scholar, try to do and teach our students is to say, and I agree, Peter's reading of to be your naamgenoot. But I mean, it's the theology is deeply problematic, for women, for people who is in suffering, a situation of ongoing suffering. So what's alternative? What can you do better? I mean, in terms of feminist and queer and post-colonial, it's also to empower, to say you're valuable, as a woman, as your experience matter. The LGBTIQ community, what you are feeling is right. I mean, sort of to become sort of readings that sort of then empower, strengthen, value, attest value in terms of post-colonial, that the subaltern, those who do not have voices, that they have voices, that they have experiences, that they can speak, that they should speak, that we have to not force them to be silent. So it's an ongoing process, but I mean, it's very clear about what needs to be done. So, but thank you so much, Peter, for this.
Julian, if I can engage you a bit, Donnie, if I may, and this is my discomfort. I can, and many of us can go into a congregation and we preach the theology that we are comfortable with. It's not necessarily theology that liberates. It's just theology that it's on the ears, it's familiar, and it works. I've no problem. But I think our task is to to scrutinize the theologies that we think is a theology that we should be comfortable with.
And
Because that would, because it keeps, in my view, we say that we are part of this rainbow nation, unity and empowerment and all of that, but our theology doesn't speak to that. At least this example does not speak to it, but yet we embrace this theology. We would often embrace it and just keep on suffering. I mean, just follow status quo.
Well, and even to continue with that, you don't even know what the other is suffering because you don't get to listen, because you speak from a position from power and privilege. No, and I think that is, so all of these approaches, feminist, post-colonial, queer, also masculinity studies, I mean, which takes very clear also the role of a male privilege also as, it starts with those who suffer, starts with those who are in pain, the bodies in pain. Exactly. And I think that is what we as a church and communities need to do, is to look who is in pain, and start with the experience, make room for them, and talk back then also to the biblical text, if there's a theology that sort of protect the perpetrator, protect the status quo. But so, thanks. And I mean, you as a white male, all the other white males, it's what we need is allies. And I mean, and that is the important thing. I mean, and what you are doing is being an ally. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. We still have, I think, 5 minutes for this session, and then we, I see for All Saints Plumstead and also Sydney. So first, All Saints Plumstead.
Thanks, Danny. And thanks, Peter. And I think I move more from what Prof. Julie just ended off, because I think what is being really a challenge as you speaking, I put on the cap of a preacher. And also I managed to swap and take the cap of the one who's sitting in the pews and listening to these kinds of texts, because this is really what you're nailing it when you say we really need to transform the way we read. And I think that's a real challenge for us. And maybe my question is, are we doing enough then to graft a biblical interpretation to move away from making us interpreters for the status quo, so that we try and move from this laxed kind of comfortable theology and redress the theology that is currently there, so that we transform our reading of the text to be tools of liberation. And I was really struck very, very hard by that. And what Julie's saying, that those who sit in there, if you don't start by putting yourself in the position of the one who's oppressed, who's listening to this text, what message are we then? How do we transform that their listening of the text to really mean real hope? So thanks for that. And maybe then, if you can possibly, if you are able to, how do we redress our theology, and especially putting on the cap of those who are preachers, our interpretive approaches?
Yes, Sydney, thank you for this, and it remains a challenge. As someone who not often gets an opportunity to deliver a sermon and partake in a liturgical space, it's difficult, because I know the congregants that's sitting there that I'm preaching to, and how do I represent those that I know are being left outside, that are excluded, but still speak to the audience, the congregants in front of me. It's not easy, but I have to remain true to myself, what I genuinely believe, and remain sincere. And that's the best, in my view, the best way to do it. I don't mean harm, not to those who keep on, recycling these theologies. I don't mean harm. I am just very concerned about the effect it has on those the others, and I cannot remain silent. I need to say it on the pulpit, and whether I'm informally elsewhere or in class or on a pulpit, I need to be consistent in all of it.
Thank you. I think it's 12 o'clock. I saw another hand, but it's I don't see it anymore. So I think we perhaps continue with a general discussion to all the different speakers. So we have perhaps I can start with it. I see on the show conversation, I see also a question that Julie, can Prof speak more on Ruth healing the symbolic wounds? So I think, yeah, Julie, can you just answer that question, please?
Yes, yeah, and I mean, I think part of that is sort of, again, what happens if you bring stories together, you know, sort of, because the story of Lot's daughters, which is such a horrible story, reading it also as a story of trauma. And then if you go fast forward, you go to the book of Ruth, that's another story also of a Moabite woman protagonist, and you bring these two together, then it's kind of interesting how both stories deal with exclusion, and inclusion, and also the other, and in some sense, it seems like the book of Ruth is a different type of story. It's, you know, so like my professor Catherine Sarkefeld, she used to speak also of the book of Ruth as showing this notion of a peaceable kingdom, you know, where foreigners are included, where old are included, where everyone has enough food, you know, that God provides again in the house of Bethlehem, the house of bread, where there was no food for a long time. But I mean, in the complexities also of the stories, which I love about the Bible, is that we don't shy away from the complexities and the ambiguities and the sort of the not happy endings, because I mean, even the story can be show something of the long process of healing that doesn't always take place, because actually the story of Ruth can be also a story about where, again, what we do to foreigners and how they just disappear, and how we take their children and they have to become like us. So some people have read it also in that way. But on the other hand, it is also a story where, you know, where the foreigner is the gifts are also recognized, and in part of the chesed and the loyalty and part of the story. So, and I mean, just for me, bringing that into conversation with the bookshop, something also about female agency and of being able to stand up again after your husband has died. And with the story of Ruth as well, her husband has died, Naomi's mother-in-law's husband has died. You know, they're in a context of famine, but to get up, to move, to go to another town, to start anew, hoping that the community will let them in and be accepted. And I mean, I think that if you even tell a story of a life, where do you pause it? Because I mean, even the story, I mean, we all are en route, we all journey, and sometimes we meet communities that are more accepting than others, and sometimes you're in the wilderness in a context of famine, but then in the midst of that, there's always just to recognize the kindness and the hope. And actually, I mean, just with in DIFS, we were talking about in the preachers of food texts. So Peter also helped on Old Testament side. So thank you so much, Peter. There were a lot of people working on Old Testament. But yeah, to even the one sermon this morning, I mean, recognizing God's manna, God's provision of foods when it comes from unexpected sources. So I think the story of Ruth is also a food text. And that's all that.
Thank you. There's a question of Sydney Kutu. I think that's to Peter. Sydney.
Thank you. Am I heard?
Yeah, we heard you. We hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm just asking to Peter, what do you think the cause of the fear is? Is it coming from for not saying what it's supposed to be said? I'm just wondering if the message is this, and we are afraid to tell it. Have you, in your research, can you tell us what you think is the cause of the fear? Where is the fear coming from? Thank you.
Thank you, certainly a difficult one. I would let me speculate. Let me speculate. People in general, I mean, change is not an easy thing. Although we're adaptable beings, but change is not. So take myself as exemplary of the perpetrator in the history of this country. So there's a political change. The landscape has changed significantly. There's a social, cultural, many changes. I mean, things are different now. What you still have is your congregation and the theology of your congregation, and the fear is don't lose that as well. I mean, if there's one place that I could live out my identity within the confines of the borders of this country, it's in my congregation. That's where I want to pray in my mother tongue, where I want to just hear the theologies that I'm familiar with. Please don't touch that. At least I still have that. And I think that's the, if I may speculate, that's the fear of the last thing standing between certainty and uncertainty, between myself and total destruction. Part of my identity is taken up in this theology, and I can't let this go. But that's speculation.
Thank you very much. I see also a comment there. I think that part of this fear is losing power, losing money as well. That's also a practical thing. I've got Derek Mayberg. Derek. Derek, are you still there?
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah, Derek, yeah.
Sorry, I'm a technophobe. I forgot to unmute. Both to Peter and Julie, and the sequence here of names mentioned are just at random. It's not intended saying anything. Looking at the text that you were referring to, I want to get back to the context of the reader. Now, Julie, I've checked this one out. Now, I'm in a Xhosa speaking congregation set up in the Eastern Cape. I am a white privileged male. Let me put the card on the table. We've looked at Ruth at one stage, and the whole, yes, the foreigner, you know, all those kind of things. And I threw in a question and said, would you do that for your mother-in-law? Those ladies were absolutely horrified. They said they'll never do it. We know, well, some mothers-in-law are not so kind, and I don't think Naomi was very kind either, as you pointed out. So the context of the reader, or the listener to the text, makes a major impact on how to understand it. And then Peter, I vaguely remember at a previous winter school, you made similar comments also on Peter. I think that was one Peter. And the young lady said, you know, I was suffering under the apartheid regime, but this text did help me to come to grips, at least where I cannot change anything, to understand that Jesus is still with me in this crisis. My question then would be, can one be, the book of Peter then, or the text that you quoted, can that be used in a constructive way? Yes, we see the dangers. I mean, I'm quite convinced can it be used in a constructive way when people cannot do anything about their suffering? Isn't it some kind of comfort to them to say, but listen, yes, that it does not make it right. We don't condone the suffering, but but Jesus is there with you. He suffered before you. Your comments, please, both of you.
Yes, no, those are both excellent questions. I'm also burning to say something about the second one, but I'll leave that to Peter. So, but that speaks to the quality also of the questions. Now, the first one, of course, I mean, context matters, and I, you know, when you read a text, you bring your own context to you, and I think to that text, and I think that is what stories and trauma narratives are so helpful. Because even in that space, I mean, thinking about what you would do for your own mother-in-law, that mother-in-laws differ. Also, and you know, partly what is that is also it engages the reader, and it helps the reader to think, and also to not take the text. That maybe go back to what Anita said earlier. I mean, sort of in a literal way of implying the text. But I mean, it invites conversation, and you know, even the choices, even when you follow some of these characters into their stories. I mean, often when we watch movies, we can see what a character is doing, which is not good, and that character should stop doing that. But you know, but the character just keeps going down that road. But it's often what even happens is that if you watch a character making bad decisions, you as a reader or viewer can say, "I'm not doing that." Or I can connect on that point, but not on that. And even the way the text, the multiplicity in interpretations of a given text, open up these possibilities, which all in the end relates to what we all are struggling with. How can we live a good life? How can we do our work, be kind, be, you know, create a community wherever we go? So.
Excellent question. Well, the one possibility is I suggested to my student, let's just rip out 1 Peter. That's a possibility. So we don't need to deal with it. There's another possibility, and that to me is a constructive way. So I need, and people like myself should partake in reading the text. And just acknowledge the fact that this embedded theology does favor me. I mean, that is constructive in itself. So it does benefit me. Obviously it does. And we need to acknowledge, and not just me and people like me and the people I represent, and I'm generalizing. So that's constructive. And then we need to read it with the other. And I'm not, I mean, I don't want to say that no one could find some solitude in this text, not at all. But I will be asking, you know, whether this theology is so strategically brilliant that you don't even recognize that it's holding you captive. But that's not for me to decide. At least I'm not going to say, please just keep on suffering because Christ is not suffering. Because that in itself is another dilemma. But because I'm not suffering, I mean, for all practical purposes, in comparison, I'm not suffering in the least. Whether I experience COVID or whatever else, but you cannot compare the two. So clearly, I'm not suffering like Christ is suffering. So I cannot identify with that text myself, unfortunately.
Thank you. I think we've got 15 minutes left. I just remind you that you're also welcome to direct questions to Prof. Marius Nel. I see also Professor Anita Klute still on the line there.
Don't have to.
Perhaps Marius, you're also welcome. You're also a New Testament scholar, so you're welcome also to make some comments on some of the previous questions. So do you want to make some comments on some of the questions also directed to Peter?
Maybe a broad comment about our position towards these texts and each other, and where we position ourselves. And I think this is important, that I think Julie mentioned it, that we are aware of the effect of our readings and what it does. But I always come to a text and I try and ask myself, what would I not want to hear directed towards myself in this text? In other words, obviously I don't always succeed in this, but it's very easy using text to say what I want them to say. And this could be the traditional, I think Peter gave an example of this. People come to the congregation and you know what they want to hear and you just repeat what they want to hear. But this could also pertain to other contexts. So one of the reasons that I like engaging with these texts, and I feel called to engage with these texts, is that they challenge me as well. Even the things that I'm very clear in my mind, I think these are good and valid ideas that I hold, and I've got good intentions in doing certain things. These texts tend to kick me in the teeth sometimes, even in regard to that. So I always try and say, I try and come to the text and read with the text, against the text, but why would I bother reading these texts if they don't speak to me as well and challenge me, if you follow what I'm saying? And obviously I need people to help me, because I can give myself a pass very easily that I actually do what the text asked, or engage with these texts in a serious manner. So maybe just to put it on the table, I think what we need to help ourselves with is to say, okay, maybe I've domesticated these texts, and we can do this in different ways to say different things. I mean, white privileged males do it in a certain way, but all of us tend to go in this direction. And then that sometimes the discomfort in the text is so much that we realize, okay, it actually says something to me as well. So going back to the apocalyptic thing, this whole polarities, we all pick a pole that comes easy to us, and we sort of cling to that pole. Maybe we should try and broaden our whole spectrum. I'm not saying everything goes, everything is correct, every viewpoint is valid. All I'm saying is it's always interesting to broaden your own perspective. That's my question. So that's why I enjoy listening to Julie and to Peter. I think it just stretches your perspective.
The challenges us. Just in the beginning, Yvette Moses made a comment, very interesting, but after Julie's speech, what I got from this is that telling one story of trauma without leaving out any of the awful details can be a vehicle of healing. I would imagine this is not just for individual trauma, but also group trauma. Julie, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, and that's also opening up a whole other can of worms, and sort of a whole other interesting conversation. I think that's also at the heart of what's the healing of memories, and sort of in terms of sort of creating spaces where people can share their memories, and what they also try to do in the TRC as well, sort of to be able to get people to tell their stories. What psychologists would also tell you, there's always the possibility for re-traumatization. And I mean, in the question, if you retell that painful story, I mean, of course, which is not in a safe space, then that it can actually do sometimes more harm than good. And also, the question is also if a space is not safe, where, I mean, you can imagine if a rape victim have to tell a story with the rapist in the midst, and she still doesn't feel safe. It's very difficult to sort of even to tell your story and to come to. So what often happens, what Judith Harriman speaks about, the first thing is establishing safety, because for any trauma or recovery to take place from trauma, I mean, because if the space is not safe, I mean, nobody is be able to move towards healing of their memories. And then the second point, if the space is safe and secure and the person feels safe, then to start memory retelling and sort of reframing memories. And so I do some of that also in my monograph, bringing some of those theorists that help us think about narratives as a way of reframing traumatic memories. But then in the third place, and that's so important also, that's the notion of re-establishing connections, because that is the point where community is rebuilt, reclaimed, because, what you also say, individual and collective goes hand in hand. A lot of people's individually so harmed and hurt, but it affects the community as a whole. So if, that's why the two need to work in tandem as well. And also think of our country. I mean, there's so many people who are hurt on an individual level, but also the community as a whole is sort of deeply traumatized as well.
Thank you, Julie. Prof. Anita Klute raised her hand. She also made a comment. Anita?
Okay, no, I think maybe people did read my comments, and I just want to say to Julian Peter, always I agree with him. The reason why I'm asking in terms of the process, because that is what's happening still today. People are now, in my experience, just ignoring the sticks in faith communities. Because it becomes more difficult to sort of keep this theology in place in that sense. But it doesn't mean the theology did go away. It's almost like a silent way of keeping this thing alive. And that is my biggest issue with in faith communities. That's why I'm asking about the reading of the text and the process, because I'm really scared about how there's a bit of a silence, but how the things that is terribly wrong is still so alive. So how do you sort of help, especially women, to come out and read these texts with their own experience, like Julia said? Because for me, that seems to be the only way we're going to get out of this, because they can bring their experience to the table and sort of really because you can't ignore the text now, it's there. You see, that's the thing, because in our tradition, the text is kind of everything. So we can't ignore them now. We can't take them out of the Bible, it's there. But now what do we do with the text? And also think in terms of training, this is a big responsibility to help people to reread, because my other experience is that when students go out, they go back to a very naive way of engaging with the Bible, which is so painful, because we have the hope that people will go there and sort of have a new way of engaging with, especially these problematic. I mean, the Bible is not that straightforward, we know that, but because the thing is, this ignorance of this text now, I think, is more dangerous in the context where we are now than it was preached before in sort of interpreting this way. Yeah, so that is my heavy-heartedness on this whole issue. Yes, Maurice, I found your thing very interesting. I want to read that. But it's very complex, eh? If you talk about the whole apocalyptic idea, because that was my experience with this virus thing, was that people say, I won't take, they don't go the route of saying this is God's, what is judgment, but it's closely to that, saying that the virus didn't come from God, so the vaccine can't come from God either. If there's some kind of straight connection with God and everything that happens on earth, which is also saying about what theology is going on ground level in terms of directly speaking to God, hearing from God, and knowing what God is doing. So thank you guys for participating.
There's a comment of Birgit Brandt. Perhaps, Marius, you can respond to that. Another constructive approach should be to illustrate the historical difference between then and now. We read text now. Our questions and insights are shaped by our own experience. What was the experience then? Perhaps, Marius, I want you to respond to that, please.
No, I think I think that's one thing we can learn, Donnie, from reading ancient texts that arise in ancient history, is to see to look at their context. I mean, if you look at the experience, say for instance, behind something like Revelation, or even the Jewish apocalyptic text, these are people who are suffering deeply traumatic things, and what we've also seen is they've also tried certain responses to their societies, and the value that we have is we can look back and see, okay, how did that pan out? How did that play out? Say for instance, the idea of violent resistance against the Roman Empire. I mean, the Revelation post-dates that. They know that did not go well. I mean, so we need to look at the context in which these documents were written. That obviously that helps. Because I mean, if somebody was reading Revelation, let's say in the late 90s of the 1st century, I mean, they would have known people who've died in the Jewish war. So that would play into this is not a theoretical question for them. What do we do in the face of injustice when the worldly powers always seem to win in the end? How do you respond to that? What keeps you going at night if that is your reality? It's not a theoretical thing for them. They would have known if you tick these people off. Uber violence will befall you, and how do you respond to it? How do you keep going? So I think that's a very good question, because one way of seeing our context anew is to look at different ancient contexts and how people responded to these texts. I think that is the value of having some sort of historical notion and then saying, okay, we are the first people to experience this. We can learn from other peoples of faith who've tried to do this in the past and find their way. And why was it so compelling? Why did it help them? Because obviously it did help them because they kept these documents. I mean, it's not as if they just kept everything. So why did they keep 1 Peter? Why did they keep Ruth? Why did they keep these documents? Why did it seem to speak to people over generations? And maybe explore that. So yeah, no, we need to keep the context in mind.
Thanks very much. We have 5 minutes left. I don't know if there's another question. Perhaps you also want to respond, also want to add something, Peter or Julie, on the last question. I don't see other hands, but yeah. So yeah, Peter, do you want to add something, or Julie, on what Mari said?
Yes, no, I think that is so important. Also, what Marius also said, and I think what Anita. I mean, maybe what gives me hope is actually venues like this winter school, and that people interrogate some of the texts, and that you keep inviting the Bible people back that ask difficult questions and deal with difficult text, but that we as people involved with ministry also help our parishioners to ask those difficult questions, because life is not easy. And I mean, and I think the texts help us to grow in that sort of more sophisticated, nuanced way of dealing also with biblical text. So that gives me hope. So thank you, Anita and Donnie, and to all of you who've been involved with this.
Peter, do you want to add something?
No, I can just say aiming to that. I just wish that the context would be considered more seriously. It's as if we just go there. We know exactly what we're talking about. Grab it and then run with it. That's the one. I think we should do much more to make to take the historical context into consideration. And secondly, we have to acknowledge that there's a theology that developed later on than the text that we had here, and those theologies are embedded in those texts. That is not. Should not be elevated above history. We have to acknowledge that the theologies developed later on, and they are embedded in historical texts that are much earlier. And we need to point it out, and we need to be aware of this. But engaging the text, what Marius said is to just dig in and confront the text. That's what we should do. That's why not? And this is what we're here for. Let's read it and be uncomfortable and yeah. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. I think we've got a minute left. So thanks very much for every speaker. We can, when we together, we can raise our hands, but we can just say, yeah, thanks very much. We had Pentecost, we had a speaker, and his theme was difficulty is our business. Difficult. So it's not easy nowadays to be a pastor or be a leader or an academic in South Africa, but that's our business. Again, for you also helping us in this process. And yes, we can pray for another, and we can try to also to live the hope. And the Bible is also there to help us. But you are also welcome to contact Peter or Julie or Marius, you see their email addresses. You're welcome to contact them. They've got all the answers. But we also invite you tomorrow.
Donnie first. He's got the real answer.
Yeah. I struggle with the congregation as well, and I asked them as well. But no, it's nice to be challenged. But tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, you're welcome also to reconvene. Yeah, and thanks again for Anita and the whole team that helped us with this. When we planned this winter school, we thought, oh, everything will be okay. But then someone said, perhaps we must try to plan a virtual one. There can be problems. So that was a prophetic word, unfortunately, but I'm glad that we're still here. And thanks for everyone also who linked to this session today. Have a good day and see you tomorrow 9 o'clock. God bless.
Keep well. Bye.
Bye, keep well.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.